Good morning, Jubilee Church. How is everyone doing today? Good. Can we all rise to our feet, please? For those of you joining on YouTube, good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us online. If you guys could rise with us as well, please do. Today marks the first week of Advent season. Woo! For those of you wondering, we have this area set up for baptism for second service, so just letting you guys know, so it's not a question in the back of your minds. All right, before we begin, let's pray. Lord, we come to you, Father, to worship and honor you once again, as a family, as a community, as a church. Lord, as we go into this time, we ask that you once again help us focus our minds and our hearts on you. Father, you deserve our full worship, every part of us. We worship you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you guys remember, starting Advent season, we start doing Christmas songs again. So, look forward to that. Okay, let's worship our Lord. Amen. Hark the herald. Hark the herald angels sing. Glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild. God and sinners reconciled. Amen. Joyful all ye nations rise. Join the triumph of the sky, with angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Hail the heaven-born Prince of Peace, hail the Son of Righteousness. To all he brings, risen with healing wings. Mild he laid his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the songs of earth, born to give them second birth. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. King of heaven, come down. King of heaven, come down. Let your glory reign, shining like the day. King of heaven, come. King of heaven, rise. Of heaven, rise up. Who can stand against us? You are strong to save in your mighty name. King of heaven, come. Christ the everlasting Lord. In time, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. Mild he lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give second birth. Hark the herald angels sing. your glory reign, shining like the day. King of heaven, come. King of heaven, rise up. Who can stand against us? You are strong to save in your mighty name. King of heaven, come. Amen, amen. Of all the praise we could ever bring, amen. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe, we live for you. Sing Jesus a name. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe, we live for you. Oh, we live for you. Sing holy. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Sing Jesus a name. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Amen. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe, we live for you. Oh, we live for you. Sing holy. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Lead us in your love, God, and I will build my life, and I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be. Sing that again. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no
So church, it's the last Sunday of the month, and so on the last Sunday we celebrate Family Sunday. And so at this time, I'm going to ask you guys to take a moment to pray for your families. I know that we're here kind of sitting socially distanced right now, but if your family is next to you right now, I think it's okay right now if we kind of get close to our families and just hold them tight. If your families are not here right now, they might be away somewhere else, let's hold them tight in our hearts and let's take this opportunity to lift them up to God, especially in this holiday season, this Advent season, just lifting our families up to God in love. Hope, peace, joy, love, the Advent theme. So let's take this moment right now to pray for our families. Right now, let's pray. We come to you this Advent season to lift up our families here on earth that you have given to us, Lord, so that we may love one another like you have loved us. Whatever may be going on in the world today, whatever they may be going through right now, we know that you love us, so we can love one another. And it starts in our families, it starts in our homes, Lord. So we lift up our fathers, our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, our children. We lift them all up to you, Lord. Whatever trials they may be going through, we lift it up to you. Whatever joys that they may be going through, experiencing right now, we celebrate it together and give you all the glory and lift it all up to you, Lord. Whatever hope that they may need in their lives, we ask for your hope in their lives. Most of all, Lord, we ask for love, your love. So, Father God, we lift up our families to you. Thank you, Lord, for loving us first. May your Spirit be with each and every one of our homes during this Advent season, but also now and forevermore, Lord. We lift up our families. Thank you, Lord Jesus. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, church, we're going to continue with one more song of worship at this time. Let's continue to worship our Lord.
My cross you bore, so I could live in the freedom you died for. And now my life is yours, and I will sing of your goodness forevermore. Lift it up, worthy. Worthy is your name, Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. My shame is gone. I stand amazed in your love undeniable. Your grace goes on, and I will sing of your goodness forevermore. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Keep singing. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Sing, be exalted. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name. Keep singing. Be exalted now in the angels can sing this forever, for all eternity. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Oh, worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Father, we declare that you are so worthy. You're holy, almighty God. Lord, remind us once again that all creation bows down to you. That you spoke everything into existence. That without you, life is so meaningless, Lord. Father, yes, we declare you are worthy, you are holy. We can't say it enough. Yes, God, we thank you for this time of worship. You're so amazing. You open our eyes in wonder. We thank you, Lord. We exalt you, Almighty God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, church, let's give the Lord a clap offering. Amen. Amen. He's so worthy. All right, can we please stay standing as we confess the Apostles' Creed? I believe in God, the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God, the Father Almighty, whence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the holy universal church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Amen. Church, you may take your seats.
All right. Good morning and happy first Sunday of Advent. Can you believe it? Yeah. We're remembering the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ again, and praise the Lord for that indeed. I'm happy to be here to share with us our church announcements. But before I do, I'd like to go ahead and take this opportunity to welcome anyone who is a newcomer here. We have an orientation, Joe, right? Do we have the orientation? Okay. Because we have baptisms, we don't have an orientation. But if you come back next week, every other week we have orientations for newcomers to get to know us a little bit and for us to get to know you as well. So please do come back and visit. But for today, we still nonetheless would like to welcome you. So if this is your first time to Jubilee, never been here before, please do not be shy. And instead raise your hand up high so we can welcome you. Anyone here at First Time Jubilee? There we go. I see some in the reflection. All right, wonderful. In the front, welcome. Welcome to Jubilee. All right, and again, please do try to come back again so we can have that time of orientation together. All right, I already mentioned it, but hey, for Sunday of Advent, let's go ahead and prepare our hearts the right way to celebrate this season, the real reason for the season, right? We have, as mentioned, also baptisms. We have two, but they will be in the second service. We have Caitlin McCullough and Ara Cho. But because they're going to be baptized at the second service, that's the service that they attend, and that's their community, right? So we wanted to keep it there, and as a result of that, for us, we will still be celebrating this, but after our offering time, we'll have a time of prayer for them. Even though we don't get to see them be baptized, we still want to remember them and lift them up before the Lord. So let's prepare to go ahead and bless them that way. As we kicked off last week on Thanksgiving Sunday, our winter fundraisers are the following. We want to make sure that this time is a time of holiday cheer, not just for us, but for our neighbors. We want to make sure that we remember that we are here to not take, but to give. Thanksgiving indeed. So our first of our fundraisers are for our homeless outreach partnership with Nanumi. We are raising 10 million won towards the purchase of sleeping bags so we can go ahead and distribute this to the homeless community around Seoul Station. So please go ahead and give towards that. All this, by the way, is on Jubilink. You have to go to our giving site, jubilink.com, Jubilink. You set up an account if you haven't done that already, and it's like easy peasy giving, all right? With all just clicking, and you'll be good to go. Thank you for your response already. We have 5%, but obviously we have a little bit more work to do. So let's continue to give towards that. The next giving is towards the Women's Hope Center. This organization helps crisis pregnancies to make sure that crisis pregnancies are handled well. The baby is born healthy, mother is taken care of, single moms are taken care of as well. So this is obviously a worthy cause. It's to prevent other alternatives to crisis pregnancies. So let's go ahead and give towards the Women's Hope Center. This is up at 8%. Wonderful job, all right? Let's continue to press on in that. And last but not least, we have our Footstool Member Care Retreat, as Ryan and Carolyn shared last week. Footstool is a missions organization supporting missions work in the 1040 window, which is, if you didn't know, the 10 and 40 latitudinal lines bordered by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That window of land is where the most underdeveloped and in need, but also unreached peoples are in the world. And we are in that window as a reached people, as they say, as those who know the Lord. And we want to make sure that we don't take this opportunity to go ahead and support that work. And Footstool Mission Center is very much in the center of that. And their member care retreat is coming up in February, where they gather member missionaries, or we call them members, to really support them. It's a free retreat for them, but it's not free for the organization. So they have a goal of 15 million won, and we're at 5% of that. So let's go ahead and give towards that as well. By the way, one extra thing for the Mission Center retreat. I think this is a really critical time in missions history. We are living it. COVID has very much changed the landscape of how missions is done. And this is a very critical retreat for those who have been on the field for decades upon decades. There are a lot of them are hunkering down here in Korea. And we're planning to use this opportunity to get together and really pray and seek the Lord's will in this. So again, another worthy cause. Footstool Mission Center's retreat, member care retreat. We have a neighborhood cleanup, part of our community renewal programs, next Sunday, December 5th from 12 to 2 p.m. What is neighborhood cleanup? We walk out into our neighborhood and clean it up. We wear our Jubilee vests. We have our little trash picking up tong thingies with trash bags, and we go ahead and beautify our neighborhood and serve our neighbors this way. It's a simple way, but it's a beautiful way that we can all participate. Let's go ahead and get signed up. You can get signed up on our app, by the way. We have a Mom's Life group that meets weekly, but for this holiday season, they're doing a cookie decoration event. Join us for our first offline activity in 2 years. This is the Mom's Christmas cookie decoration led by Grace Swain, who is professional, by the way. Keep that in mind. This is hosted by the Mom's Life group. This is December 7th. It's coming up right around the corner from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. I believe that's a Tuesday, December 7th. Is that right? Yes. Spots are limited. Childcare is provided, and just 10,000 won to cover the costs of the material. So if you're interested, go to the app and check it out. You can look it up on the little website there, or you can email sarah.han, sarah.han@jubileesoul.com for more information. The worship ministry, we're looking for people to help out, for volunteers. On the instrumental side, they're looking to fill positions for bass and electric guitar. On the production side, we need several people experienced with sound and with camera work. So if you have any kind of interest and or background in this, please email worship@jubileesoul.com to apply. Our COVID update is that there is none except what you hear on the news right now. We'll see what happens, but we know that things have... Actually, I just read something yesterday. So this is not official, but they're going to announce something new tomorrow. Is that true? I think I read something about that. Anyway, we know that the critical cases are going up with the numbers going up. So I wonder what's going to happen. The original plan was to start going into the next level of life with COVID, like in a week or two, but I don't think that's happening. So let's be on our toes while we continue to push in this reality that we live in, okay? push forward rather. And of course, our electronic giving, we have those options in dollar and won. Let's continue to be faithful with our tithes and offerings unto the Lord for ourselves, our health, and also the health of our community as well. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and transition into a time of scripture reading and prayer. Our Deacon Jin Yang will be coming up to lead that time.
Good morning, church. Today's word from Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. I'll be reading NIV. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what the Lord has said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Church, would you please bow your head and join me in a prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful time that we could gather together and praise your name. Thank you for giving us this seasonal Advent to remind us that you are with us and how you have been faithful to us. But we often live as we are the master of our lives, thinking that we can control our time and everything that we have. Please forgive us our tunnel vision and bless us to see what really happening in the spiritual realm. Give us thankful hearts for everything is coming from you, so that we can have humble hearts before you. Lord, when you heard about the word hope and Messiah, it is easy to think about a superhero who has mighty power enough to save the world. But Jesus, you came to this world as a helpless baby and spent 3 years as a humble carpenter. This might not be a picture that we have for Messiah, but sometimes we don't understand what God is doing for his purpose, because we are limited human beings to fully grasp your wisdom and wonderful plans. But Jesus, you completely understand the human's weaknesses and shortcomings, because you have been through all things. And because of the life of Jesus, 2,000 years later, God is still manifests to us how great your love is for us. And Lord, you say that you are with us. What a great promise we have. Please open our eyes to see what is really happening beyond this world and wait on you, because we have confidence that you work all things together for the good of those who love you. Please anoint Pastor Joe today. Thank you for his stubborn heart. Cover him with your mighty power and protect him from any spiritual attacks, because the enemy loves to tear our beloved leaders down. When Pastor Joe delivers your message to us, let our hearts be the good soil which produces fruits 160 or 30 times what we hear today. Thank you, God. You never left us alone and have been with us all the time. That is our true hope. I pray all this in our precious Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's great to be worshiping with all of you. Well, actually, I'm going to take my mask off. Sorry about that. It's great to be worshiping with all of you today. Before we begin, like we do every Sunday, let's take a brief moment to turn to our neighbors and greet one another. And because today is the first Sunday of Advent, let's turn to each other and say, Happy first Sunday of Advent. Can we do that right now? All right. So today is the first Sunday of Advent, and Advent simply means arrival or coming. And of course, the arrival we are waiting for will take place on Christmas as we celebrate the coming and the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so, to celebrate Advent, we here at Jubilee, we like to use this time as an opportunity to share in some of the more liturgical practices of the Universal Church. And so that is why today I am wearing this pastoral robe, as well as I also have this purple stole draped around my neck. And it's purple because purple is the traditional color of Advent. Because purple represents a waiting and an anticipation of something that is yet to come. And purple is also the color of royalty. Because the one we are waiting for to come is our Lord and King, Jesus Christ. Another thing we'll be doing on Advent, on each Sunday of Advent that is we'll be lighting these Advent candles that you see before me. And each Advent candle, it represents the themes of Advent, which are hope, peace, joy, and love. And we will celebrate each week by lighting each candle with the corresponding theme as well. But there's a center candle, a white candle, and we're going to actually save this one for Christmas Eve because this is the Christ candle. Because on Christmas Eve, that's when Jesus Christ comes. And so on the Christ candle, we're going to light on that evening. And you know, last year we weren't able to gather for Christmas Eve to do it together, but this year I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to do it together this Christmas Eve. And so with that said, I guess it's time to light the first candle. You guys ready for this? And so it is my joy and honor to light the first Advent candle, the candle of hope. Let's do this. Come on. Yes. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. And so as the popular Christmas song goes, it is the most wonderful time of the year, isn't it? And regardless of whether you are a Christian or not, and whatever holiday traditions that you may have, many people all over the world like to celebrate this holiday season. Now, I don't know what you guys think about when you guys think about Advent and Christmas, but for me, and I think for many of us, we think about things like Christmas trees and you know, like bright lights on the city streets, nativity scenes of the birth of the baby Jesus on the front yards of churches, jolly men dressed as Santa Claus as they go ho, 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 as they ring their Salvation Army bells. Indeed, I hope that we can all agree that this is supposed to be a season of great cheer and joy. Me and my family, we just started getting into the holiday spirit ourselves. Just the other day, we put up our Christmas tree and we put up our Christmas lights, and I gotta say, they look really beautiful this year. And our kids are already whispering in our ears what they expect to find underneath the Christmas tree come Christmas morning. But if you recall from last Christmas didn't feel much like Christmas at all. It was more like, meh. Just like the old Dr. Seuss story goes, the Grinch indeed stole Christmas last year for many of us. You know, I actually wrote a poem about this last year for one of our weekly devotionals in our Jubilee Church app. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read for you just a few lines, okay? 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through Seoul City, not a street corner was stirring, not even a little bitty. The shops were all dark and the cash registers did not ring, and the familiar tunes of Last Christmas, this year no one sings. Year-end parties were canceled and no one's at church, except for those where someone with COVID may lurch. And no one's exchanging white elephant gifts. And with subway restrictions past 9, there are no lifts. And just as everyone was depressed and annoyed that this Christmas really sucked and was lacking of joy, I was reminded of Bethlehem 2,000 years ago about a little virgin named Mary and her betrothed hubby named Joe. And I'm going to stop right there because obviously I'm no William Shakespeare or Robert Frost. And if you want to read the rest of it, you can actually go back to last year's Christmas app Devo. Before I take it down, that is, because now I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed. But I think you guys get the point that last year we lost a lot of holiday cheer and joy during the Advent season. And of course, it wasn't just that we missed out on all the commercial and cultural stuff out there, but we couldn't even get together at church either. Now, when I speak of this, you might be thinking that the whole cause of this was because of COVID-19. And that may have been the immediate cause. But there's actually something a lot more spiritual going on here. And it has to do with our Advent themes of hope, peace, joy, and love. You see, during Advent, there's a reason why we celebrate these 4 themes. It's because it is with the birth of Jesus that these things come into our lives. And Jesus not only brings these things with him, but he is the embodiment of it all. Jesus himself is hope, peace, joy, and love. And without Jesus, we don't have any of that. And so Satan, the enemy, he knows this, and he will do whatever he can to try to take all of that away from us. And the way he tries to do it is he tries to take Jesus away from us. And what better way to do that than to take Christmas away? If Jesus were not born, if we did not celebrate Christmas, then there would be no hope, peace, joy, and love in this earth. Now, all of these Advent themes are equally important. But of the 4, I would argue that there is one that Satan wants to snuff out the most. And that is our theme today of hope. I mean, think about it for a moment. Even if we did not have peace and our lives were in utter our lives were in utter turmoil, and even if our lives were a complete mess, it was a wreck, we can still have hope. And even a little bit of hope might be just enough to make you want to get out of bed and face the new day. But the same goes for joy and love as well. Even if you are so empty of joy and you are in utter despair, and even if you have no love and you feel like you have no friends and nobody loves you, just a little bit of hope may be all that you need to keep you going until you find joy and love once again. But hope is the final straw. It's the last line of defense. Without hope, you're left with nothing. And the world feels so dark and empty, and it may feel like there's no purpose to keep going. And when that happens, Satan wins. Satan wins over you, and Satan wins over the world. Satan becomes the ruler of the world. That's what happens in a world without hope. But we know better than this. We have hope. We have hope in a different story. And in this story, Satan does not win. He is not the ruler or king, but instead he is stomped on and he is crushed. And there is another king. In fact, he is the King of Kings and he is the Lord of Lords, and his name is Jesus. And that, my friends, is why we celebrate this holiday season. I know it sounds cliche, but Jesus truly is the reason for the season. Now, the name Jesus itself, it has a meaning. Jesus literally means Jehovah or Yahweh saves. Or in other words, the Lord God saves. And certainly we know that Jesus came to save the world. But in our passage today in Matthew 1 and verse 23, Jesus is referred to by another name, the name Emmanuel. Now, of course, this is not the name that was given to him at his birth. But this name Emmanuel comes from a prophecy in the book of Isaiah some 700 years before Jesus' birth about the Messiah who will one day come to save the world. And in the Hebrew, Emmanuel means God with us. Let me say that again. God with us. Now that expression is something that too many of us, we just kind of take for granted during the Advent season. And we don't fully grasp the weight of those words. But do you realize that in this expression of Emmanuel, God with us, is perhaps the most incredible miracle in all of human history? Not to say that the other miracles of Jesus were not remarkable, because they all were. But this one, man, this one is something else. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you guys have already heard the story. But there was a virgin named Mary who was betrothed, or in today's terms, you might say that she was engaged to a man named Joseph. But before they could finalize their wedding, she was found to be pregnant with a child. But how could this be? Mary was still a virgin who had never known the touch of any man. But an angel of the Lord told her, and also separately her betrothed husband Joseph, "Don't be alarmed, for Mary has conceived not of a man, but by the Holy Spirit." How incredible is that? And so she was now pregnant with a child who was both her own human flesh and blood, but at the same time, this child was also the divine Son of God. You see, this right here is the great miracle of Christmas. How this child, conceived of the Holy Spirit and born of a virgin, could come into this world and be both fully human and also fully God. When Isaiah prophesied about Emmanuel, God with us, it was not about some mystical and spiritual presence like some fog or smoke. But he was talking about how God would really and physically dwell among us as one of us. And this is one of the greatest things to ever happen for us. In fact, do you know that this is so important that we confess it every week as part of our weekly worship? That's what we're doing when we recite the Apostles' Creed and we say, "I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who's conceived of the Virgin Mary and conceived of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary." You know, another Christian confession of faith called the Nicene Creed, it says it even more poignantly. We believe in one God. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. By the power of the Holy Spirit, he became incarnate from the Virgin and was made man. The great miracle of Christmas was that God made himself to become a man to be among us. Jesus Christ, the Messiah who saves, he chose to be Emmanuel, God with us. And this makes all the difference in the world in this Advent season. This is not only the reason for our hope, but Emmanuel, God with us. He himself is our hope. He is our only hope. And so for the rest of our time today, I want us to think about this question. Why is it so significant that Jesus, Emmanuel, was conceived of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary? In other words, why did he need to be both fully God and also fully man? And why is this such great hope for us? Because if we know the answer to this, I know that it will change our lives forever. Because Emmanuel, Jesus, God with us, will change your life forever. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a brief look at Emmanuel, God with us, from 3 different perspectives. First, we'll see why it's so important that Jesus had to make himself fully human. Why did the creator of the universe choose to become like us? Then we'll see why it's important that Jesus also had to be fully God. And finally, we'll see why it's so important that he had to be fully God and fully man together at the same time as well. So the first question, why is it significant that Jesus was fully human? And not to beat around the bush, the simple answer is this. Jesus became a man because he wanted to come into, or he chose to come close to us. He chose to come into our mess and into this fallen world. You know, every single one of us, we are all sinful people. And we are all messed up people living in an equally messed up and fallen world. We are messed up in our bodies. We are messed up in our heads. We are emotional wrecks. We all have messed up circumstances in our lives. And no matter how much we try, and I know that we have all tried, we can't save ourselves. We're that messed up. But do you know what God decided to do? He decided that he loved us so much that he was going to come into our mess. Every time I read Philippians 2, it blows my mind that Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Do you guys realize what this means? The God who created the universe and who was above all things, he voluntarily chose to become just like us, with all of our weaknesses and all of our human frailties. Or as Eugene Peterson wrote in the Message Bible in John 1:14, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. I mean, check it out. You know, even though we sing Silent Night, Holy Night, I will bet you that 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, away in a manger, baby Jesus wasn't all that silent. Because babies cry all the time. I'm hungry. I'm sleepy. I'm grumpy. I just pooped. I hope you're not offended that I say that Jesus cried like a baby, because he once was a baby himself. Jesus was fully human physically. He got hungry. He got tired and he needed to sleep. He went ouch when he bumped his knee against the table. Mentally, Luke tells us that as a boy, Jesus still had to learn just like other boys did as well. And emotionally, Jesus wept and he became sad just like us. At times, like that one time at the temple, he also got angry. In the Garden of Gethsemane, before he was arrested, we can see that he even became overwhelmed. And in various places of Scripture, we can see that Jesus even had a sense of humor as well. Like that one time when he said, hey, before you tell your brother about the speck of dust in his eye, maybe you should take out that huge plank of wood out of your eye first. Now, you guys might not be laughing right now, but I tell you, in first century Galilee, that joke would have been a big hit. But why did Jesus do this? Why did Jesus voluntarily become a man? It's because he wanted to identify with us in every way possible. Because Jesus knew that we were living in a world full of mess. And Jesus loved us so much that he wanted to come into our mess. And by doing that, Jesus says to us, here I am. Here I am for you. Now you might think to yourself, well, that's all good and all, but my life is really messed up. Nobody, and I mean nobody, can know the pain that I'm going through. But you know what? Jesus knows. Jesus knows. Now let me show you. Even in the story of Jesus' birth here in Matthew, and you may have heard, or you may have read it or heard it 100 times before without knowing this. But this story was a really, really messy story. You may have not known this before, but this story was actually quite scandalous. You see, there was this man, Joseph, and he was not a rich man, but he came from a great family line, the family line of King David. And then there was this young girl named Mary, and she was still probably a teenager, as was the marriage customs of the time. And they were betrothed for marriage. And although earlier I said that betrothal was like an engagement, in actuality it was a lot more than that. You see, in Jewish wedding traditions, there were two parts to a wedding. There was the betrothal, which was a legally binding agreement between the groom and the father of the bride that basically said that they were married, but they just haven't had the sexual relations just yet between husband and wife. But then there was also the wedding banquet, or the consummation, which took place about a year after the betrothal. And it was then when the husband and wife would finally be able to truly come together as husband and wife. So what happened in the year between the betrothal and the consummation? Now, part of it was the groom would go off and he would prepare a place to live for himself and his bride. But a greater reason for this actually had to do with the bride. Because for her, it was a period of something that they would call sanctification. Now, what that meant was it was a time to make sure that the bride was sexually pure and not sexually immoral or promiscuous. And so no one was to have sexual relations with the bride during this time of sanctification, including the groom, or else there would be big trouble. And if the bride were to become pregnant during this time, well, it would have proved that she was actually an adulterous woman. And so when it was found out that Mary was with child, this would have been scandalous news. The immediate reaction of the people would have been, "Oh, Mary, what a naughty little girl." And the penalty for such scandalous behavior was typically a public divorce and public shame. Or even worse, according to Old Testament tradition, she could have been stoned to death for adultery. So you can imagine the tremendous fear and confusion Mary must have gone through when she found out that she was pregnant. Her situation would have been a nightmare of a mess. And to add on to that, she was innocent. She probably hadn't even ever even held the hand of a boy before in her life. And yet, she could be publicly shamed and even executed. Can you imagine how Mary must have felt? And can you imagine what Joseph must have thought at first as well? You know, I trusted this girl, Mary, but now I feel so betrayed. What do I do? Do I publicly shame her? Or do I quietly try to hide this under the rug? And if I still went ahead and married her, people will know that this is not my child. What kind of shame and harm would this bring upon me and my family? And how can I even consider allowing this illegitimate child to be part of the royal line of King David? And also, we have to think about it from the child's perspective as well. This baby in the womb would have been unwanted and an unwelcome child. And do you know what happened to unwanted children during this time? There were no orphanages during this time. So they would be left outside the city on heaps of dung so that they could die there alone. This is what the baby Jesus was potentially facing. From all three perspectives, Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus, all of these circumstances seem so hopeless. They all seem so dark. It's all a complete and total mess. But that's what our Lord Jesus chose to do. He chose to come into the world under these exact hopeless circumstances. He chose to come into the utter ugliness and mess of the world that we live in. And he did this because he loves us so much. As Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tested in every way, just as we are." And how is this possible? It's because he chose to become human and to come into the world and into our mess. That's why it's so significant that our Lord Jesus had to come fully as a man, even as a baby, to Mary and Joseph. Let me ask you guys, are you allowing Jesus into your lives every day? Are you allowing Jesus to come into your mess every day? If not, then why not? Because that's why Jesus came into this world. You know, it doesn't matter what it is, whether you're struggling at work or at school or at home, whether you're going through financial struggles and you're about to lose everything, whether you feel betrayed and alone, whether you feel like you're at the end of your rope. Please, have hope. Because Jesus is hope. Jesus is God Emmanuel, God with us. If you think nobody knows, Jesus knows. Jesus knows. Because he went through it all himself and he did it all for us. What an amazing God we have. Amen. Amen. But now, here's where we need to talk a little bit about the divinity of Jesus. You know, it's good that Jesus came as a man. It's good to know that we have a friend in Jesus to listen to us and to empathize with everything that we're going through. And indeed, Jesus is that friend. But Jesus is more than that. Jesus is not only human because he was born of the Virgin Mary, but he is also fully God because he was conceived of the Holy Spirit. If the man, Jesus, knows everything about us because he went through it himself, then the divine God, Jesus, came so he can bring a bit of heaven into this fallen world and into the messiness of our fallen lives. In the brokenness of this fallen world, for man where there seems to be no way, our Lord Jesus makes a way. He makes the impossible possible. As the popular song goes, He is the waymaker, the miracle worker, and the light in the darkness. He is our God. Jesus is fully God, and as God, He has power over sickness and disease. He makes the lame walk, and He heals the sick. He commands nature. The wind and waves listen to Him. He has authority over sin. No one can forgive sin. Jesus can. And Jesus even has authority over death, where He can raise the dead back to life. Because Jesus is God, in the reality of the brokenness of the world that we live in, He opens up heaven to us and allows us to tap into the things of heaven. He gives us access to the wisdom and insights of God that we absolutely need for our lives. And He even gives us access to the supernatural power of God that can overcome all things. Jesus gives us all of this because He Himself is God. God with us. Now, going back to the scandalous story of the birth of Jesus, we know that Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus, they were all in a great mess, right? And especially for Joseph, he had a great dilemma. What was he going to do with this pregnant girl? Now, the easy thing for him to do was to do what anyone else would have done. Divorce the girl, publicly shame her, and just wipe his hands clean of the situation. And nobody would have blamed him one bit for that, because that's how things were done. But God's ways are far greater than our ways. First, we get a little taste of the supernatural here. At night, in a dream, an angel of the Lord came to Joseph. And the angel said to him, "Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. The child she carries is conceived of the Holy Spirit. And you're going to name him Jesus. And he's going to be the Savior of the world." I mean, talk about supernatural. You can't get more supernatural than that, right? And you know what Joseph did immediately following the following morning? He did not divorce Mary, but instead he obeyed God, and he went and he took Mary to be his wife. That's pretty amazing. You know, many of us say, "I wish that God would speak directly to me and then I would know what His will is." Well, even if He did, I don't know if many of us could handle it and obey like Joseph did. Because for Joseph, I know that it took a lot of courage for him to do this. It took a lot of supernatural courage and also a lot of supernatural faith in God as well. And it was because he trusted and believed in God that even greater miracles began to take place. Mary's great fear and shame, it was now gone. And she now had safe protection from the world. And even the fate of the unborn and unwanted child, he too was now safe from abandonment and death. But this story is not just about the heavenly supernatural, like angels and visions and dreams. But it's also about godly wisdom and insight as well. You see, when God is with us, He also gives us His eyes to see things that we can never see before. For example, I'm sure we're all familiar that God specially chose Mary to be the mother of his son. the mother of Christ. But have you ever considered this? That God also specially chose Joseph to be the earthly father as well. It says here that Joseph was a righteous man. From the get-go, he didn't want to shame Mary, but instead he thought about quietly divorcing her so he can save her from public shame. God, in his great wisdom, already knew that Joseph was a godly man. And in his wisdom, God knew that he would be a good earthly father for his only begotten son. And so when the wisdom of heaven opened up for Joseph, do you know what he did for the child? He took this unborn child, who everyone else in the world would have thought of as a bastard. And they would have left him out to die. And he adopted this child as his own son to take on the inheritance and the bloodline to be an heir of the throne of King David. Did you guys ever stop to think that the birth story of Jesus is also a story of adoption? Well, it is. That's because our God is a God of love and mercy and compassion. These are heavenly things. And just like Joseph adopted the unwanted and unlovable child, God also does the same for us. All of this is a divine taste of heaven. You see, the entire story of the birth of Jesus is a story of great hope, where it seemed like there was no hope. The story of Jesus' birth is about Emmanuel, God with us, because God came into the mess of our lives and he brought with him the hope of heaven on earth for us, so we can find hope in him. You know, I asked you guys earlier, and I ask you again, are you inviting Jesus into your life every day? Because if you do, you not only have a good friend in Jesus, but yet you get to tap into a little bit of heaven every day as well. This is who our God is. This is our Emmanuel. So this brings us to the final point. You know, we've talked about Jesus being fully human, and we've talked about Jesus being fully God. But finally, we have to look at why it's so significant that he had to be both fully human and fully God at the same time. And for this, we need to go back to the prophet Isaiah, where we get this concept of Emmanuel, God with us. This comes from Isaiah 7:14, which is a popular passage during the Advent season. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Now, you may also know of Isaiah chapter 9 and chapter 11 as well, which are also very popular Advent passages during the season about the coming of Christ. From Isaiah 9, it talks about a child is born and the government is on his shoulders, and he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And Isaiah 11 speaks about a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. And all of these prophecies together are speaking about a messianic king who will one day come to save the world. Now, we often look at these passages individually in isolation. But in fact, they are meant to be understood in terms of a complex string of events together, which tell of a greater story. In Isaiah 7, the king is about to be born. In Isaiah 9, he is already born and is reigning as everlasting and mighty God. And in Isaiah 11, he is supernaturally reigning in his spirit. And this messianic king is so much different from the kings of the world. And his conquest of the world and his way of saving is so much different as well. And if we continue further into Isaiah, we get a very clear picture of this. In fact, Isaiah 53 clearly describes how the king will save. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. You see, the whole purpose that Jesus was born was so that he could die for us to save the world. He died to be the perfect sacrifice for us, to take up the punishment that we deserved on our behalf for us. And for this to take place, Jesus had to be fully man and also fully God all at once. Jesus had to be fully man because Jesus had to be the perfect representative of mankind. He had to be the perfect man without sin. He had to be the perfect man without blemish. He had to be our perfect human sacrifice. And when he died on the cross, he also had to be fully God, because God is eternal, and the sacrifice had to be final, once and for all eternity. And so for everyone who believes in Christ, that Christ died for you, the work is done. It is finished. Indeed, the work of Jesus coming to this earth was to be with us and to help us in every circumstance of life. But the greater purpose was not so that bad people like us can be a little better, but instead, he came to bring dead people to life. We were all dead in our sins, and he died so we can live. And that, my friends, is the greatest Christmas miracle of all. You know, the Bible says that when we put our faith in Jesus, we become new creations. The old is gone and the new is come. It is here. But did you know that the overarching theme of this birth story of Jesus in Matthew is also talking about this as well? Now, in most English translations of Matthew 1:18, it will say something like, "This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about." At least that's what it says in the NIV translation. But a more literal translation of the original Greek would be like, "The Genesis," or the beginning of Jesus the Messiah. In the Greek, we see this word Genesis. And this would immediately make you think of the first book of the Bible and the story of the creation of the universe. But with the birth of Jesus, this is the story of a new creation. By Jesus' birth, life, death, resurrection, and glorification, and through our faith in him, we are now made into new creations. And we live in the promise and the hope of a new heavens and a new earth that will come one day. Our hope is not in this fallen earth, but our hope is that one day we will forever be with God in a perfect and incorruptible world. There will be no sickness, no more pain, no more sorrow, no more death. Jesus was born on this earth so that through his death, we could become new creations ourselves and also look forward to the new heavens and the new earth we will share with him forever one day. If you are looking for a reason for hope in the messiness in our lives, then look no further. Jesus is our hope. He is our only hope. He is Emmanuel, God with us, so that in eternity, it can also be us with God forever. Can I get an amen? So in conclusion, let us have hope this Advent season. Let us have great hope. I hope this Christmas season will be full of joy for all of us. I hope you get to have a lot of Christmas parties this year. I hope we will be able to gather together Christmas Eve to do Silent Night, Holy Night. I hope this year that I'll find some warm socks underneath the Christmas tree for me. But more than all of this, I hope that our God, our hope, is in Christ and in Christ alone. He is Emmanuel, God with us. He is with us fully in his humanity, and he has gone through everything that we are going through right now. He is with us in his divinity as he brings down heaven to earth for us every day. But most importantly, he is God with us because he is both man and God together to make our dead souls come to life and to make a way for us to rule with him forever in his new creation. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, here on earth and also in heaven for all eternity as well. May this hope and this blessing be our joy in this Advent season. Amen. Church, let's pray. And as we pray, I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to pray and ask for Jesus to come into your lives. Come into the messiness of each and one of our lives. Because Jesus knows. And whatever it is you're going through right now, I want you guys to ask Jesus to bring in a little bit of heaven. Bring a little taste of heaven into your lives. But also, I'm going to ask you guys to look upon Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. Both man and both God together. To give our lives to him, to believe in him. So that we may become new creations and enjoy the new creation with him forever. Church, let's pray. Dear Father God, we thank you, Lord, for your Son, Jesus, your only begotten Son, conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, come down into this world, Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus, the Lord God saves. That he came into the mess of this world, the mess of our lives. And we know that it is a mess. We confess before you that our lives are a mess, that we are sinful people, and this world is fallen. And yet you chose to do that, Lord. You chose to come down into our mess, to be our friend, to be our counselor, because you love us, to go through all of that for us. And with you, you brought down a bit of heaven so that we are not alone, that the God of the universe is with us in every moment of our lives, in every mess of our lives. How amazing is that? And you did this also that you can die for us. The perfect representative of man, but also God, so that we may not perish and the work is done forever, that we may have everlasting life in you, and that we may rule with you one day in your new creation forever and ever. Thank you, Lord Jesus. You truly are our only hope. So help us to continue to worship you and glorify you. Our only hope, our Lord Jesus Christ, during this Advent season. We thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. So church, we're going to continue right now in a time of offering and worship, continue to worship our Lord. So at this time, please feel free to give your offerings in the offering boxes, or also go online, and let's continue to worship our Lord Jesus Christ, our King, our only hope.
Christ alone. power of Christ we stand.
Yes, Lord Jesus. Hallelujah, Lord Jesus. Thank you, Lord Jesus. Thank you, Lord Jesus, because truly in Christ alone is our only hope, Lord. So we thank you, Lord. We thank you for, frankly, we thank you for everything. We thank you for everything that you've done for us, Lord, for always being with us, Lord. So may our song, may our praise, may it be a pleasing offering to you, Lord. May our prayers be a pleasing offering to you. May our offering be a pleasing offering to you, Lord. So we thank you, Lord. You truly are the most amazing gift that we can ever have in this Advent season. We thank you, Lord Jesus. We thank you. In Jesus' name, we all pray. Amen. All right, church, I'm going to ask you to take your seats for a moment because we're actually going to go into a time of, well, not into a time of baptism because we don't have baptism during our first service, but I do want to kind of share a little bit about our two sisters who are going to be baptized this afternoon. We have the joy today of baptizing Caitlin McCullough and also Ara Cho. And, just to tell you a little bit about their stories. Caitlin, she came to meet the Lord when she was 14. She's upstairs right now, I believe, serving in children's ministry, and she's also part of our college life groups. And so she came to meet the Lord when she was 14, but this entire time she never had an opportunity to be in a community where she felt like it was her own community, to be baptized in front of her own, her friends, her brothers and sisters in Christ. And so she's actually here as an exchange student, and she's going to be leaving soon, and hopefully she'll be back again. But while she was here, before she left, she's like, this is my community where I want to get baptized. And so that's why she made the special request that she can be baptized, and we wanted to honor that. And so Caitlin today, she's going to be baptized during our second service. And then at that also, last week we also asked if anybody wanted to get baptized since Caitlin was getting baptized. And a sister came, and her name is Ara. And her entire life, no one told her about Jesus. She didn't know the Lord. And then this February, someone told her about Jesus. And then in March, she's like, I believe in Jesus. And so she's still new to this faith thing. But when I was speaking to her, I could feel the presence of the Holy Spirit within her, just moving her. She was shy because she doesn't have any family or friends that are also, Christians. But we have family here. And so I encouraged her, if the Holy Spirit is moving in you, you have family here at Jubilee. And so she confirmed this week also that she's going to be baptized. So at this time, church, even though we're not going to be able to witness it here, we do want to continue to bless her as one church, one family of Christ, one community. So if I can ask you guys to stand up, I know their photos are up on the screen, so maybe we can vicariously reach out our hands to the photo. Both of them. So that's Ara, that's Caitlin. And if we can take a moment to just reach out and lift them up to the Lord as they get baptized this afternoon. Let's pray, church. So we thank you, Lord Jesus. We thank you for Caitlin and Ara. We thank you that you came as Emmanuel into their lives, into their hearts. And with the confession of their heart, the confession of their tongue, and later this afternoon with the confession of baptism, they will truly become new creations in you. The old is gone and the new has come. So we bless them, Lord. Help us to continue to encourage them, walk with them, be with them. They're brothers and sisters in faith in Christ. And we all celebrate this today, but we're all going to be celebrating both Caitlin and Ara forever in heaven as well. So we thank you for their baptism today. May you walk with them and be with them, and your presence guide them all the days of their lives. We thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's give up a clap round. All right, church, let's close our time today with doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Church, let's pray the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Now the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of the Father, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be upon all those here who have called upon the name of Emmanuel, God with us, who has come to die for us so that we may have life in Him. May this anointing, may this blessing be upon all those here now and forevermore. Amen. All right, everybody, have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Please remember to lower your tray tables so we can know where to disinfect. No newcomers today, but yeah, go in peace.